morning, Wareham. It is Friday, July 10th. We have a great show here for you, the news headlines, the weather report, and today in history. This morning, we're going to air my extensive documentary on racialized police communication, also known as white collar crime. That is C-A-L-L-E-R, collar crime. Also, find out what it is to be a hay farmer in Rochester. But first, before we get to any of that, let's take this moment to thank Not Your Average Antiques, an antique shop down Cranberry Highway in East Wareham, for donating the props that you see in the morning show. So stay tuned, because the news headlines and the weather report are up next. There has been a total of 7 fatalities in relates to drug overdose in Wareham. Wareham Week reports that these deaths bring the total number of overdose this year to 12. Wareham police have also responded to 69 overdoses this year, 38 of which have occurred since this year on March 1st. And moving on to our next news, Wareham reports a total of 201 COVID-19 cases. There have been 21 deaths, of which 14 were in nursing homes and 1 was in an assisted living facility. Currently, the town says there are 7 active cases, which is up from 5 earlier this week. And gyms are open this week. They actually opened this Monday. But the privilege comes with certain restrictions. Masks and crowd control are in order. So please call your local gym to find out what you need before you drive there for a workout. And that concludes this morning news headlines. Stay with us. The weather focus is next. Rain and thunderstorms are in this week's weather forecast. Today, temperatures will rise to the 80s. We will have scattered thunderstorms and periodic rain. Tomorrow, Saturday, and also Sunday, we're going to have temperatures rising to the 80s. We are going to experience some isolated thunderstorms and rain throughout the day. So it is not a great week to go to the beach. But do you know what this week is good for? Staying at home, minding your distance. This concludes this morning and the weekend's weather forecast. Stay with us. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to continue with our program.
Today's cell phones are not only an extension of our arms, but a life tool. Hello, I am Maureen Farrington from Advantage Custom Apps. I am here today to talk about a certain app, a tool that will help you navigate your way through the Wareham community. The WCTV app places your local community in the palm of your hand. The app is a place where you will find local events, town meetings, local and school sports, community interest stories, compelling interviews, and most of all, the ability to shop local. Connect to the Wareham app by going to your web browser and typing in wctv.app. And then, once you bring up the web link, you have the opportunity of adding WCTV's app to your home screen. Once you download the app and save it to your home screen, you will then have the opportunity to, with the touch of a finger, hit the call button, which we call WCTV. The refer us button, you can refer the app to your friends and families. There's a Facebook share button if you'd like to put that on your Facebook page as well. And here is the menu tab. On the menu tab, we have YouTube videos, new program proposal, events that WCTV is hosting, a photo gallery, contact button, and can lead you right to their website. We also have a shop local tab. When you touch on that, you'll see the local businesses that you can frequent. Also, there's an About Us tab telling you some information about WCTV, their hours and directions, This here will take you right to their Facebook page. There is a donate button if you would like to donate to WCTV, and a join button that will let you join their community. Many local establishments are listing their business on the WCTV app. And you can too. It's a great way to showcase your business to your existing customers and your potential new ones. For a nominal fee, you could list your business on the Shop Local tab as well. A percentage of that fee goes to fund a scholarship for an outgoing senior. So be in the now and get the WCTV app on your home screen.
Welcome back. So let's find out what it is like to be a hay farmer in Rochester. I stopped Ed Johnson in Rochester, who is a hay farmer, to get this scoop. Take a look.
Well, my cut is a 1968 John Deere 4020. I've had it for 22 years, and this one it came from Pennsylvania. And this is 1962 3010 that came from Arkansas. You know, it used to always start like Labor Day, Memorial Day, but now it rains every Memorial Day, so you can't. Usually first week in June I start cutting, depending on the weather. I started 2 weeks ago, cut all that and this, and then it rained every other day for a week, so couldn't do anything. Yeah, first time I baled was 12 years old, 1954.
He worked for a farmer in Rochester, earning $2 an hour back then.
I just like to do it. So then, this is my parents' land at first, and I bought it from them. And then I worked for 40 years for a utility contractor. And I retired 14 years ago.
His hay farm spans for 12 acres. Way back in the 1800s, this land used to be an apple orchard. His father bought the land in 1936, growing daffodils and shipping them to New York.
But that was back in the 30s and 40s, you know.
So how many steps are there into making a bell?
Cut it, then you tether it, turn it over, dry it, to keep drying it, and then rake it in windrows, and then you bale it. It takes about 4 days. If the wind blows out of the north, you can do it in 3 days, because the north wind is dry, south wind is wet. So it's damp, so it doesn't dry out as fast. And if you don't dry it, you could start your bonfire, or hail start rotting on you. It won't be any good for anything. That's why I only cut a little at a time. So if I lose it, I don't lose a lot.
You've been very lucky. We had really great weather since we filmed on Monday.
Now it says tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow night. So that's why I was going to do 2, and then so I just keep going around. Hey, this is better yet.
This is better yet?
Yeah.
If you knew.
Cut the whole field now.
I know. If this was guaranteed, we would have done all of this.
Cut the whole thing. It would take me 2 hours.
Oh.
Lost 8 acres last year. Second cut, and I had it all cut, and it rained. It wasn't supposed to rain for 5 days, and it rained the next day. So that was no good.
Ed says there isn't a lot of competition in Rochester for hay farming.
Not very now. There's no farms around. A lot of hay in New York and Canada come down. You know, they buy it there. Nobody wants to spend the money on the equipment. And the weather's terrible. Like now, you don't know what it's going to do.
Because of climate change, Ed can only count on making 2 cuts a season.
Used to get 3 cuts when the summers were really good, way back in the 70s. But now it's a finer and better feed. So it's worth more.
This hay farm spans for 12 acres. He does all the work himself.
That's me. That's me. Yeah. No good to get fat and ugly.
Hello, and thank you for being with us this morning. We are broadcasting from our WCTV studio in Wareham. This is Good Morning Wareham, your source for local news, weather, and more information. And now for a moment in history. Let's take a look at where we were today in history. Okay, this day in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, the so-called Scopes monkey trials begins with John Thomas Scopes, a young high school science teacher accused of teaching evolution in violation of a Tennessee state law. Back then, the law about teaching any theory that contradicted the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible was considered a misdemeanor that was punishable by a fine. Also, today in history, in 2018, oh my goodness, this is just 2 years ago, the last of 12 Thai youth soccer players and their coach are safely rescued and transported to a local hospital. The Wild Boars teammates and their coach were out exploring a cave when they were trapped underground as monsoon rains flooded the cave's entrance. The search took 9 days. Everybody made out of there nicely and safe. Also today in 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore is sworn in as the 13th President of these United States. President Zachary Taylor had died the day before, 5 days after falling ill with a severe intestinal ailment on the 4th of July. Also today, as usual, we celebrate everybody's birthday, and today's birthday, the lucky winner is Sofia Margarita Varegra. Sofia is a Colombian-American actress, television producer, presenter, and a model. She was born today in 1972. She turns 47 years old today. She still looks quite great. Look at that picture. And that concludes this morning history segment. To learn more cool historical facts, please go online at history.com. Stay with us. The coffee segment is next. Welcome back, Wareham. This morning we are going to air my exclusive program looking at racialized police communication, also known as white collar crime, collar with C-A-L-L-E-R. This documentary is a WCTV original presentation. Enjoy. Black people are using cell phones and the power of social media to share the experiences of existing while Black in America. That is, doing everyday legal activities and yet facing harassment by having the police called on them. And regardless of the ubiquity of such reported cases, living while Black is not a new social phenomenon, but a way of life for Black people, dating back in history from slavery, slave patrols, lynching, Jim Crow laws, to today, social profiling in the form of white-collar crime. White-collar crime, a term coined by Michael Harriot, who wrote, "White-collar crime, the worst white people police calls of all time." As published under the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, white-collar crime is racialized police communication. The term is collectively defined as the practice of police reporting against Black persons who are not engaged in criminal behavior. Racialized police communication may involve calls, complaints, or reports to law enforcement against Blacks made out of implicit or unconscious bias, or reports made out of the specific desire to leverage law enforcement mistreatment of Blacks to harm the victim. Just this year alone, we have witnessed the Amy Cooper incident in New York Central Park, Civitlana Flom in Upper West Side Manhattan, Professor Shaheen Bonner in Bay State University, Tom Austin, venture capitalist in Minneapolis. On this program, we are going to take a look at white-collar crime, examining its origin, propagation, and harm. My curiosity about white-collar crime took me to the backyard of Dr. Ahmed Abdal, the founder and director of Bridgewater State University Educational Neuroscience Applications, to learn about how the brain discriminates.
The brain itself is ready to discriminate just because of the structure. It wants to look for patterns so that it can effectively make conclusions quickly.
Those patterns Dr. Abdal is talking about are the social cues, the stereotypes, and many more factors that make up a person's profile. Dr. Abdal says we learn those patterns from a very young age, and our generalization of those patterns is tainted.
Actually, about 2.5 or 3 years old, they do not assign anything to, it doesn't mean like there are two people of different races, for example, different colors. That baby doesn't say this one is better than the other one. Then this is the role of the society when the society comes in and says, no, this is good because, this is bad because. And these things can be direct or indirect based on how the parents interact with the children, based on how if the child is verbal, nonverbal.
So what happens when the brain cannot find a pattern?
If it doesn't match what is here, then it makes stress because it's going to immediately put the brain on a high drive or a kind of a mode where it has to consume more energy to make sense of that difference. Why is this here? It doesn't belong here.
So would we say that that stress you're talking about is what we would call or what would result to unconscious bias?
That is, yes, that is the core of it.
What is even more perplexing is that people can engage in a negative bias behavior unaware.
You might not even realize it yourself. You might not even realize it yourself. I mean, you might say, oh, I am not, but the fact is, if you look deeply, this is why self-reflection is one of the keys.
Those subtle biases can result to a white-collar crime. This rage is best articulated under a social concept called Know Your Place aggression. Dr. Emily Field, the coordinator of African American Studies at Bridgewater State University, explains.
I'd like to introduce a concept from a colleague of mine, Dr. Caretha Mitchell, who teaches at Ohio State University. She calls this Know Your Place aggression. And she says that when African Americans and other marginalized peoples, when they achieve a level of success, even if it's the modest success of claiming a place in society, so feeling the freedom to go jogging in one's own neighborhood, that is met with aggression. And she calls it Know Your Place aggression.
Dr. Field goes on to provide a little historical context on Black intolerance in Massachusetts.
The idea of white American freedom and unfreedom for people of color, particularly Native Americans and African Americans, those ideas grew up together. So Massachusetts, many people don't know, Massachusetts was the first state, first colony to write into its laws that there would be slavery. So in 1641, in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which was a statement of the settlers' ideas of freedom, they include a section, in section 91, saying there will be no slavery among us. We're not going to have captivity. We're not going to have slavery. And then there's a big except. And the except is for people taken captive in just wars, that would be Native Americans, and strangers who are sold to us lawfully, that would be people of African descent. So even as in Massachusetts, white people were writing down their own freedoms, they were writing into the law the unfreedom of people of color.
And even when Massachusetts abolished slavery in the late 1700s, people of color were warned out of town and looked at as outsiders. And Dr. Field says even though this history is over 200 years old, those subtle microaggressions in the form of white-collar crime is a form of this.
So that we don't have the system in Massachusetts officially of warning out anymore, warning people to get out of town, but having the police repeatedly called on you in your own neighborhood is a form of aggression, a form of harassment.
And these microaggressions cannot be subdued by simply blending in or adhering to white decorum.
I know that children of color are taught, look, you have to not be noisy, you have to dress a certain way, you have to act a certain way, because if you do, white people will regard you with respect and you'll show them that you don't belong to these negative stereotypes. And first of all, that's unfair, because as a white parent, I don't have to tell my child that. But even when Black people in particular observe all of those rules, they are still seen as suspicious, as out of place.
In the late 1970s to the late 1980s, during the Boston busing crisis, there was a reverse migration in Boston, also known as white flight. White people live in Boston because they do not want their children to be integrated with Black children. Dr. Joanne Della Giustina, Department Chair of Criminal Justice at Bridgewater State University, explains.
So a lot of the south suburbs of Boston and southeastern Massachusetts have family histories of people who ran away from Boston because they didn't want their white children going to school with Black children. And so even if so again, it's that culture, and there's that fear, that goes back, to the parents and grandparents of people who are living in that part of Massachusetts.
The lack of diversity within white communities is conducive to racial bias. Let's take a look at the town of Sharon for an example, a suburb south of Boston. Sharon is 77% white, 16.4% Asians, 4.4% Hispanic or Latinx, and about 2.8% Black people. From what had transpired in Minneapolis with the killing of George Floyd in the custody of Minneapolis police officers and the Black Lives Matter protests across the country, Chief John Ford of Sharon Police Department says he has been learning a lot from his minority residents.
There are issues that they have that I wasn't even aware of. I think we haven't done a good job of listening to our minority in this community. And it's not that we wouldn't, but I don't think we've precipitated the connection. We haven't gone out and asked, you know what? And sometimes that's all that you need to hear, because opening that floodgate already in this last week, the thing on Facebook, I've got people now coming in tomorrow with an 8-year-old kid who's Black, and his father said he's terrified because of the events and with police department. Can he come in and do a tour? I said, absolutely. There's another one that responded about her autistic son, and we have an autism program that we've connected, officers certified, and there's another opportunity. So those opportunities exist, and that totally excites me.
To understand white-collar crime, we have to take a look at the history of policing in our country.
Beginnings of policing were centered in the slave patrols during the institution of slavery, and it was designed to both catch runaway slaves and to police slaves who possibly would revolt and leave the slavery. And that was where policing began. So, and then after the Civil War, we started going through Reconstruction, and policing often, now a lot of people tend to think about it only in the South, which is where it was centered, but it actually came all the way up to Massachusetts. So during Reconstruction, the policing were still trying to control former slaves. And then we get into Jim Crow, which it continues on that way. So the institution of policing is structural and institutional. So that's where, and culture comes from the institutions when they're embedded in that way. So you have, 150, 175, 200 years of an institution that, even though it's gone through different changes, sort of continued in the same way, and the culture continues.
WGBH reported this year that according to the data collected by the Boston Police Department, 70% of people stopped by the Boston police officers last year were Black people, even though Black residents make up less than 1/4 of the city's population. The data also went on and said, while Black residents were stopped at a highly disappropriate rate, they were less likely to be issued a formal summons or citation by the Boston police.
Even today, policing in general is about social control. And it's people of color and especially young Black men who are the recipients of the worst examples of that.
So what role do the institution in the history of policing play in racialized police communication or existing while Black? Well, given the history between police and Black people, some white people are harnessing that fragile relationship to express their own biases against Black people.
We are taught from a young age that that every place is our place, and that we are allowed to kind of move around in a neutral way that everyone should respect. The idea of white people feeling that it is our responsibility and our right to regulate, to police the bodies of people of color and their movements in space. There's a long history of that. It's written into the laws in places like South Carolina and the South Carolina Slave Code in 1740, the idea that any person of color on the street will be assumed to be enslaved, and any enslaved person can be interrogated on the street by any white person. And that if the person of color in question, refuses to be interrogated, they can be killed on the spot. That's basically what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. So again, I'm reaching back into so-called ancient history, but there's a very straight line in time through to today, and many examples in between of the same kind of violence. And that was in South Carolina, which is just next door to Georgia, where Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And again, if you do the thought experiment of someone who looked like me being in these positions, it's very hard to imagine. And as a white person in middle age, that has literally never happened to me.
Because this is a race issue, Dr. Field says white people are mostly shielded from it. Take my post on Facebook under a Wareham Facebook-related page, asking Black people who have ever experienced white-collar crime to reach out to me for this program. Most of the white residents who commented under my post were very defensive, adamant that I am inciting a problem that does not exist.
So it is not just a coincidence. And I think that white people often are shielded from these realities. So I often have the experience in my classes in which white students hear for the first time, because a lot of white people live very segregated lives. We live lives in which we do not have to really hear and listen to the realities of people of color. When they hear that, when they hear their classmates describing, oh, my father came to pick me up at school and they wouldn't let him get me and they called the police, the white students realize, hey, that never happens to me. That would never happen to me.
I have another question. Why don't we see Black collar crime?
You look at the, whites as the authority, the decent majority, and to some extent the inferiority. There's an inferiority complex. I mean, if even children, when you go and say which doll is best.
Dr. Abdal is talking about the groundbreaking experiment, the white and black doll experiment of the 1940s by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, that looked at how segregation affected Black children. The experiment was commissioned again in 2010 by CNN under the renowned child psychologist Dr. Margaret Spencer.
The white one. And these kids are Black. Which doll is bad? The Black one. Which is evil? The Black. And then why? Because some kids will say, because this is Black and this is white. So, and they say to the child, in one of the videos of the experiment, you say to the child, so which one looks like you? And you see the shame on the children's faces. This one, and just the face. I mean, some of these experiments is just, you feel so bad for the child.
Decades since the initial experiment in the 1940s, the results still found that white children as a whole responded with a high rate of what researchers called white bias, identifying the color of their own skin with positive attributes and darker skin with negative attributes, revealing a notion that white is the norm and Black is wrong.
And that is where the person has the sense of inferiority, and yeah, the whites are, everything is great, but we, you would accept, a lot of stuff that would happen. And sometimes you blame themselves and they blame their own race and loathe their own race. And that is again because of the pressure that comes from the oppressing group.
So where is the harm in white collar crime?
Really need to center the very real fears of Black people in particular in this country, which have proven recently to be all too well-founded. Very real fear. I'm thinking of Black parents who have to coach their children on what to say and what not to say, and still have to worry that they might not return from a day out. So those fears are very real and should kind of be our focus. But white fear is dangerous to people of color, because imagined harm to white people is often the excuse for very real harm to Black people.
A Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review journal, What Exposes African Americans to Police Violence, published that the more interactions police officers have with Black men, the greater the likelihood that any of those encounters will trigger the foregoing racial stereotypes and precipitate violence. The journal went on and said, these police interactions may help to entrench the very racial stereotypes on which those interactions are based on. And whether the white collar was biased or non-biased, the effects of perceived discrimination are real.
Your adrenal system, there's a place called the hypothalamus. It communicates with the kidneys and the adrenal cortices of the kidneys, and it's going to deploy adrenaline, and it will deploy cortisol and chemicals that elevate your blood pressure.
And if a person is constantly traumatized or reminded of that trauma, the consequences of perceived or blunt discrimination can contribute to several health issues like high blood pressure and heart diseases.
Goes down if the woman is pregnant. That will go down to the child, to the fetus, and the baby is born 6 weeks or 8 weeks later. That baby has an elevated cortisol level and reactivity. They can't be soothed easily. They're crying. They just are agitated, and that will just a new baby coming to life with a set of problems because of discrimination.
To be clear, I'm not saying that white people should not call the police or do not have the right to call the police.
In a sense, anybody has a right if they feel like they're being threatened in a certain way. I think the problem becomes, why do they feel threatened?
And although white emotions may be real, they have to be put in a cultural context to determine their essence.
I do think that the feelings are there and they're real, but they have to be read historically. They have to be read as in cultural context. That's about how Blackness and whiteness have been constructed in this country. And the second thing I would say is that those kinds of fears, like we saw in the Amy Cooper case, are often more about the loss, the fear of loss of power and privilege, rather than actual fear for physical safety. It's very hard for me to believe that Amy Cooper really thought that this man with binoculars in Central Park, carrying his only weapon was dog treats, that he feeds to dog walkers to get them to leash their dogs. Did she really believe he was attacking her? Did she really believe he would attack her dog, who she was yanking around in the video? It's very hard to believe that. And yet she made sense of it, of her fear of losing the privilege of doing what she wanted, which was to walk her dog without a leash. She used that fear in order to kind of control him, and it became a racialized fear for her. So the feelings are real, but they need to be seen in context, and they need to be seen for what they are, which is less legitimate than the fears of Black people of being constantly harassed and sometimes killed for no reason.
Besides, we need to know that racism isn't only limited to the use of the N-word or committing violent crimes on Black people.
We think of racism in a way as if you are a racist or not a racist. And that is kind of a flawed construct. First of all of us are, especially white people, are racist. We grow up in a racist country. We are taught racist ideas. We are taught that it is polite not to recognize race. We're taught color blindness. But color blindness actually erases the experiences and the realities of people of color, so that when people of color mention race, all of a sudden white people say, wait, you're the one talking about race, you're being racist. So that's one thing. Racist actions can be performed by people who may otherwise seem like good people. And I don't think that this idea of you're either a racist or not a racist is very helpful. We all of us have imbibed racist ideas from our culture that we're part of and from our history, and we act on those.
The base of white-collar crime is prejudice. The police are used as the means to exercise that prejudice. And this is why Chief Ford says police officers have to be mindful of the so-called suspicious calls.
You can't think things anymore as if it's just, you know, oblivious to race. You have to think the sheer fact that stopping these individuals, their perception right out of the gate is that they were being called on because they were black. Now, whether or not that's the reality or not the reality, the perception to those individuals certainly does not need to have that endorsement unnecessarily. You've got to be sensitive to that. So you need to change the way you conceive that. If there was something else that generated more suspicious nature to it, then you're going to do what you have to do as a police officer.
Trying to understand what good policing is, I visited Bridgewater State University and sat down with Dr. Michael DeValve to talk about semiology, the study of social harm, focusing on defining the policies to address the harm from its origin to its end.
When we call the police, what are we seeking? So the place to begin with policing is maybe not even policing, right? We have to think about ideas that are at the core of who we are as people and how we relate to each other.
Dr. DeValve has spent his career researching and writing about peacemaking criminology. In his book, A Different Justice, he argues that love and justice are the same, although greed and oppression have made the two words function as a dichotomy.
I define love then as the art-like, meaning it's like an art-like, individualized, unconditional, aware, and endless praxis, whereby a human or organization mindfully, assertively, and continuously labors for the actualization of another human being as an end in herself, without thought of return, without reliance upon authority, without fear or possibility of cessation.
That is love.
That's love.
And so that type of love is justice.
Yes.
You also said that in order for justice to function as love, we need trust. Trust is key.
Trust is central. Yeah.
How do we not only repair, there's no repairing, how do we build trust between this institution, police as an institution, and minorities, people of color?
Well, there are two parts to that answer, I think. One is this defunding conversation, which takes a variety of forms. And so even the folks who are kind of pushing it don't necessarily agree about what it actually means, which is a key point. Some folks are talking about raise it to the ground. Some folks are talking about something like transform their institution radically. Some folks are talking about creating a thing altogether new that does many of the same things, but in fact does it vastly differently. There are also versions where we're talking about, you know, a decentralized service set where organizations are, like community organizations receive state funding and are given specific shape for accountability and whatever to do the job that they've got to do kind of in a local fashion. And there's wisdom in all of these perspectives, and I think that's a conversation perhaps for a different time. But that's, you know, trust is buildable only through authenticity. The only way to build trust. This is a classic question. I think I mentioned this before. For years, there's been a conversation in police literature, academic literature, about something called police legitimacy. You know, what can we do to achieve police legitimacy? Effectively, a thing that you can try to achieve. Well, in this case, you know, wisdom of the Buddha, Krishnamurti, or whomever you prefer, is directly relevant, right? Krishnamurti talks about education. How do I become wise? How do I become, you just do it. How do I get out of this chair, he says, talking to students. He says, well, that's like asking, how do I leave this room? Tell me the process I must use to leave the room. And Krishnamurti, you can hear him almost kind of blinking, like, then leave the room. Simply be legitimate.
In order for policing to be effective, It needs to be unique.
In the interest of authenticity, policing has to be inherently local. It has to be a localized, particularized service. The pain of a community is known well by the police, and they should be wedded to dealing with that pain as it confronts them. At bottom, invariably, the best practice is not to seek best practices, but to invent them according to need on the ground in the moment as you authentically connect with a hurt that's there. That's what policing should be.
To understand that pain, police officers need to be mindful of the history associated with their uniform.
Think beyond that. Think the next step. Think the third or fourth step down the road of the implications of your engagement because you wear a uniform and you have a history in that uniform of being racially disgusting, quite frankly. And you carry that burden, you carry that cross with you when you wear the uniform and the badge, but you also have a wonderful opportunity to change things by maybe not engaging.
When you look like an oppressor and people respond to you in that sense, you have to own it, whether you represent it or not. Right? And you have a concrete duty to work in every way possible to help transform the harm done by others who look like you into healing.
What do you think policing should look like?
I would like to think it should look like what we're doing here. The last 3 years, first of all, mission statements. I'm going to go off on some mission statements now. Police departments have these mission statements, or any business has these mission statements. Ask people in your business to tell you what that mission statement is. When I first became chief, I was at roll call, and I turned to the guy and said, all right, there was a mission statement. Fine, I took it down. I said, you give me one line in that mission statement, I'll let you go home today. No one could do it. They couldn't do it. It's been up there for years. So what the heck is the point of a mission statement if you don't know what your mission is? So one of the things that the deputy and I specifically did was to pare down the elements that we think are really important. Now, I don't know for sure if they were the most important, but they're the ones that came to my heart. And one was, number one, building trust with the community. And that's kind of a nebulous thing. You know, how do you do that? And I'll get more into that. The other one was training officers to be better officers through our evaluation process. And then finally, training, making sure that we train. So we fought with, I wouldn't say fought, we challenged the town to up our budget in training, which they did, and it gave me the opportunity to give these guys a wide range of trainings that they normally wouldn't get, prepare them for those opportunities. We're one of the few departments that are certified in dealing with autistic kids. Incredibly important, and it couldn't be more important today because there's a growing number of autistic kids and a growing number of interactions with those kids that might not necessarily go well with the police department. So within the last 3 years, we've been kind of pushing those three things home. I've had officers go out to, of all things, here's the irony, to Minnesota to a specialized trust conference that they do out in Minnesota, that David Horziger from the Trust Edge.
Once we understand the base of the crime, healing is possible.
Restorative justice looks at harm. So it says somebody causes a harm, and you bring together the person or people who've caused a harm and the person or people who've been harmed. Now, the person who has done the harm has to agree to this. They have to agree, yes, I have harmed, and because it's tearing apart the relationships in our society. So what it does is it's an attempt to try to heal those relationships. Cannot take back what happened, but to heal the relationships that exist.
The road ahead is long and arduous, but through truth and reconciliation, we can trigger true societal reform.
We in America, this is not about policing, this is about race. And we could have, to my personal view is that we need at least two. Right now we need to have one about the Black American community. And by I mean is something like a Truth and Reconciliation project. A national scale truth and reconciliation where we talk about the harms done. So it can be transformed. All harms can be transformed.
And after truth and reconciliation, what's next?
I don't know. And I don't know because we can't know. And that because it depends upon what we need. Need must guide.
You know, I think the good of all this horrendous stuff that's taking place is opening up that dialogue. What's going to be particularly difficult is learning how to open that dialogue up in a fashion that actually brings the true change in people's hearts and not more divisiveness. And you see it on Facebook, you see it on social media. You know, it's easy for the hue and cry to make a statement, but it's harder to get beyond that statement. What do we do next? And we're all in that place right now. What do we do next? Okay, we all know it's a problem. We all understand it. What do we do next?
Everyone has a role to play. I think white people need to take a special responsibility for this. I remember I was teaching in an African American studies class. I was teaching about the history of slavery, and a student said, "Wait a minute, this isn't Black history. This is white history. This is white American history of what white people did." And that's very true, and it's still very true that racism is practiced in systemic and in individual ways in our culture, and that we need to work to undo that and to do things in a different way.
And to that list, add this simple exercise to help you connect to the reason behind your thought.
We say, you know, when you put your head on the pillow, just reflect for a few minutes. You know, who did you meet? Who did you insult today? Who did you, you know, kind of feel kind of uncomfortable with, and why? And when you do these things day by day, that will definitely make a change. But being honest with ourselves, being honest.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning for another Good Morning Wareham show. If you missed us, this particular show will air this evening at 6 p.m. It will also go on our YouTube channel at Wareham Community Television on YouTube. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Remember, rain and thunder is going to be among us for this weekend, so be very, very careful. Thank you, Wareham. See you next Friday. Bye.